Welcome, everyone. I've started recording. This is the 7th of December and SIG Windows weekly meeting. This is a CNCF project, and we do follow the CNCF Code of Conduct. So please be nice to everyone. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to myself or Mark or any other leads. With that, we can go ahead and get started. We have a pretty packed agenda today, I guess, making up for the last couple of weeks. Are there any announcements that we wanted to make before we got started? I think the release is today, so 123 is coming out today. Anything else anybody wanted to say?
Yeah, I think that I need to double check on the date, but I believe that there's a contributor summit, a virtual contributor summit on the 13th of this month to kind of, celebrate the release and just have some fun and meet more contributors virtually. If anybody is available, I highly recommend to join that. I'll find a link and add it to the agenda too.
Yeah, I think people have to register for that. And then I think they will receive a Discord invite for that. They had something like this last year as well. It was quite fun.
Yeah, there's like some games, and they also appreciate some folks from different communities for the contributions they've made. So it's a good way to get involved with the community. Cool. Any other announcements? No. Okay. I don't see Muzz here today. He asked if all the doc PRs made it, and I believe host process and OS field both made it. And I think there was one or two other ones that were minor that also made it. Does anybody else have any that they wanted to discuss? I think it might be a little late at this point, but
I think it's never too late to do some minor fix-ups.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, my understanding is that most, like all the docs PRs that were especially related to enhancements were reviewed and merged, and those should all be good to go.
Cool. And is Brandon here?
Yep, I'm here. So one of the things I've been asked about a few times and just wanted to give a quick update on, I've been in communication with Mirantis. The 20.10.11 release for the Docker runtime from Mirantis is supposedly coming in sometime mid-December. That has a number of important fixes that have been brought up with us. I think there was a CVE and some other permissions issues with starting the daemon. So if you have any questions about that, let me know, and I can try to get you in contact with Mirantis. Any immediate questions there, or I guess we can move on to the next thing.
No questions, but I did want to highlight, just as like a public service announcement, that the 2010.8 version for Windows does have an issue where if you reboot the machine, the Docker daemon fails to start, and there's some file permission issues with the panic.log file that gets marked as or created as read-only. And so on a reboot, you need to delete that file. Like if you want to adopt 2010.8, you need to make sure to delete the panic.log file in program data Docker before attempting to restart the service. And that should be addressed with later versions. But that's kind of a big inconvenience.
Cool. Thanks for the update there, Brandon, and Mark for the update on the file issues. Any other comments on the Microsoft provider? I know there's some conversations happening in Slack on that. So,
would we get something similar for containerd, like have a provider for that, like Docker MSFP provider similar to that? Would we have something?
We don't have anything right now, but it is very much at the top of the list for us. That is something we're considering and trying to find a solution for.
Got it. Thank you. Like, is it tracked somewhere on GitHub?
No. This is kind of just an internal discussion we're having. But
Thank you.
yeah, it would be good to have a public issue on it.
Should we create an issue under like Microsoft Windows containers or under container D or under OneGet possibly?
If I'm not mistaken, I don't know if OneGet is accepting new submissions for new APIs. So I think that's part of what our discussion is.
Yeah, I think
I see.
WinGet is not, but Mark, I think for Windows containers, if you want to create that issue, I think I think it would be a good place for now until we figure out the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I will create an issue right now under Windows containers and we can figure out what the long-term place is.
Great. Cool. I don't see David here. I think he wanted to just bring awareness to this particular issue with the load balancer type local traffic policy. I don't see him here, so I don't know if anybody has any information on this. Otherwise, if he joins a little bit later, we can have him discuss it.
I think I saw these failing. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jay. That's what exactly David, I think, wanted to ask or bring awareness that we have seen this issue. I don't think it's fully resolved. We are talking with SIG Networking, Azure CNI team, and their team. But if others have, first of all, like awareness, be aware that there is an issue that we have confirmed. And then if anybody else has any, suggestions or something, reach out to David as he's working through a solution.
I think we have a bug already open for this, don't we? Or no, like, don't we already have? I mean, I think in general, I saw the external IP tests failing in a Windows proxy recently. I was going to ask James. I know there's that meeting before this where y'all do triage. Do we run all of the SIG network E2Es? There's about 200 of them. Do we run them in Windows? I don't even know.
There should be a different board for SIG Windows for networking itself.
Okay.
There's the SIG Windows networking tab.
Okay. I'll take a look.
I'll link it in chat.
Cool. Maybe we can look during after hours.
Is this similar local traffic policy not working? Is this similar to one that David opened up here?
We also have that MR that was opened up to fix something related to this recently.
Drop. Yeah. There is an open issue for this local traffic policy, so I'll take a look and see if we can identify if it's the same or similar or related. Okay. Any other questions on that one? Oh, I see some comments in chat. Oh, it's just Claudio linking the Windows networking. And we got an issue opened for the container D issues on the public cloud there.
I should say it's an issue that was open and closed. I opened asking for it, but I think the answer was kind of like, no, we don't want to do this. Why don't you just build it on your own?
Okay, so we can maybe reopen it since it's being discussed with Brandon now. Cool. All right, Brandon, you've got host process containers, next steps.
Yeah, sure. So with the documentation and everything being completed for 1.23, we're kind of looking forward to what's coming up next with host process containers before we GA. There are a couple things that we're investigating and thinking about right now, which is the support for custom users and kind of some file system enhancements that we're planning for 124 and 125. before GA of host process containers. What I wanted to ask the folks here, and it doesn't need to be an answer right now, but is there anything with host process containers that we might be missing that you're looking for, before we GA the feature? So if there's anything that you'd like to see in host process containers, please let us know, because this is the time to start planning for that.
I also think in addition to just like feature requests or functionality changes, I'd also like to open it up and say, are there any kind of projects or components that weren't possible previously on Windows because of the lack of privileged container support that people would like to see working with host process containers? Those are usually really good use cases to make sure that we have all of the functionality we need. I know James opened up a PR to get Windows exporter, the Prometheus Windows Node exporter working. And we've got some samples in Cluster API using, and in SIG Windows tools for running CNIs and kubeproxy running. I've got a proof of concept of the cured, the Kubernetes restart daemon open. But if there's any other projects that people would really like to see working with this, please either like contribute or comment. We'd like to make sure that we can get as much like parity with Linux components as possible here.
There is a PR open for CSI proxy to support host process containers too in that repo. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So I think this opens up just a whole lot of possibilities.
Wait, why do you need CSI proxy if you have a host? Can you just run what's going on?
That's being discussed. Or Mauricio can take over.
My name is Mauricio. I'm from SIG Storage. You're right, Ajay. We actually would not need CSI proxy, but we are now in a stage where we can, or Mark has actually submitted a PR where CSI proxy, the binary is running in a privileged container, in a host process container. So that's something in between to where we are right now and to where we want to be.
So it iterates you towards a solution. Got it. Cool. Yeah.
Yes. But well, if you're more interested about why we are thinking about not supporting this in CSI proxy, it's because as soon as we start pushing an image, because we will now have a new image for CSI proxy, then that's also something that we will have to support long term. And this month, I'm also going to be working in creating a doc to use host process containers in the CSI drivers. That's our objective. Okay,
that's good to know because we're.
Okay, cool.
That's really interesting. So is that ready to go? The CSI proxy privilege thing, is that mostly working? As a privilege pod?
Running it as just running the CSI proxy binary in a host process container is mostly working. But as Mauricio mentioned, we're figuring out people are figuring out a good support story long term. And so in order to run the actual components as host process containers and not need the proxy, that would require some more work in all of the existing components. So this is like a stopgap. People are more than welcome to try it out and validate their scenarios with it, but it sounds like this might not be kind of the official support, or like an official supported path at the moment.
Okay, it's more like a prototype. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to be in this in between, right? Because we're faced with some of these similar situations where we got 121, 122, soon to be 123. We want some feature parity across all of them, and we're having to use CSI proxy. We might end up going the host process route for the container for it as a stopgap, like you all were talking about, before we can have full host process. So CNI is the big ones for us. That and kubeproxy. Those are the two, and WinExport. Those are the three that we're going to really be rolling with host process. So
Okay.
Cool. Are there any other tools out there or libraries or anything that people are interested in seeing added for support with post-process containers besides the ones we mentioned here?
This is Anand here from Red Hat. I work closely with Arvind. One question I have is, Palo Alto basically released a note sometime back saying that process isolation containers are not secure, and they had found a way to escape from the container to the host and get access to keys and such. The question I have is that still the case with process isolation containers? Has there been any change around it? And does this expose host process containers as well, or is HPC shielded from this vulnerability?
Brandon, take that.
Sorry, is that the link you just posted in the chat?
Yeah, this was the Unit 42 article.
Oh
Brandon.
yeah. So no, this is kind of a totally separate technology for the most part, because these are host process containers are literally processes running on the host. So you will have, for the most part, full access to the host depending on what user you're running as in the host process container. And since we're running limiting to well-known service accounts right now, the capabilities and permissions are known. And when we add custom users in the future, you'll be able to restrict that further. So this is a privileged container. This is not the same level of isolation or security that Windows Server containers provide. And that vulnerability that was in that article also, has been fixed in Windows Server containers. So that's not an existing issue anymore. And Windows Server containers, they're using server silos and they have isolation from the host. So they're totally different scenarios.
So that's actually good news to my ears, because a lot of customers have been blocked with this issue on the Windows container side. So two things. So if you could send me a link to the fix for Windows containers for this Unit 42 article, that'd be great.
Sure.
And awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
And second, if I understand this right, you said host process containers are less isolated and run as privileged, so have less level of protection than Windows containers, or is it the other way around?
No, they do not have. Their goal is that they're privileged, right? Their specific use case is to be able to configure privileged access to the host, so that you can do all sorts of whatever administrative tasks require privileges on the host, and so that you can limit the limit the capabilities and privileges of the regular Windows Server containers. So you can use this as a privileged workload to do specific access to the host and limit your Windows Server containers to less privileged accounts.
Got it. Thank you.
So one note about that too is that so host process containers, the ability to restrict their usage is built into the new pod security standards and all of the pod security policy replacement that was built in, or that I believe went beta in 123 along with host process containers. So if you're concerned about that, now host process containers have like all the same ways to restrict scheduling them in based on all of the different ways that pod security policies worked for kind of with that built-in pod security policy replacement. So please read up on that if you're concerned about privilege access to the host. I believe that their host process containers are forbid in the baseline and restricted policies by default.
Okay. And really, stupid question. The host process containers, are they based on containerd runtime or Docker runtime?
Containerd.
Containerd only.
Okay, perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to add to what Anand said. I think Anand's question is really around, so there is a statement in Microsoft Docs that says, we don't trust the kernel isolation boundary, and you should use you should use Hyper-V isolation. And we don't have Hyper-V isolation yet with Windows, with Kubernetes, right? And so I think that's the main concern, Anand. Isn't that correct, Anand? It's with Hyper-V isolation versus process isolation. And because we have customers who want to mix workloads. They want to have their Linux workloads also run on the same cluster where they're running Windows workloads. Because we have been suggesting, hey, why don't you run separate clusters where you're running your Windows workloads? And some customers are not wanting to do that. So I think that's where I think Anand's question is mainly coming from. Anand, just correct me if I'm.
Yeah, no, I think that's, definitely a part of it, right? So we spoke to, I think, Taylor Brown a couple of months back, and the opinion was, he pointed us out to this tech note which said, what is that? The proper boundary for isolation in Kubernetes is the cluster itself, and not, let me get you the exact word, give me a second. Yeah, the note says, in Kubernetes or AKS elsewhere, aren't suited for hostile multi-tenant usage. Additional securities like PSP or RBAC make exploits more difficult. However, the true security when running hostile multi-tenant workloads, the hypervisor is the only level of security you should trust. The security domain for Kubernetes is the entire cluster, not the node. For hostile multi-tenant workloads, you should consider using physically isolated workloads, right?
Yes. So one thing I want to mention there is we are very conservative in our approach towards security. And we only recommend to people the options for security which we can guarantee. And with Hyper-V, we can guarantee security. Hyper-V, because it's kernel isolated, it has its own kernel, and it runs on the hypervisor, that we can guarantee a secure boundary. Windows Server containers and the process isolated containers, they have a, in general, they have a pretty high degree of security. There's very limited opportunity for what you can do with the container, even the container administrator account. It is still a very limited privileged account. And in order to even access the host, you have to, enable the container to do that from the host itself. So there's a lot of restrictions in place for the container administrator and even the container user account, which is incredibly restricted. But the thing is, because process isolated containers are sharing the kernel with the host, and we have a very conservative approach to security, we do not want to take the risk of the fact, saying to customers that there's a secure boundary there, because when you share the kernel, whether it's Linux or Windows containers, that is a vulnerability. That is a potential attack vector. Even though we're pretty sure that there's not, because of the level of restrictions that we have in place for Windows Server containers, it's a low risk, but we can't guarantee that there's zero risk, is what I'm kind of saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no. So if I were to draw, let's say, a security spectrum, right? So you could say process isolation, least secure, host process container, more secure, and then Hyper-V, most secure. Is that an accurate?
No. So host process containers are the least secure, right? Because we're giving you, you're a process on the host, right? You're a job object that's running in a just mounted storage volume on the host. And the security there is basically just whatever privileges the account the host process container is running as. So it's the same level of security as a normal user on the host.
Got it.
Process isolated containers are more secure because they have file system and namespace isolation and a bunch of checks in place that the kernel enforces. The kernel is container aware, so it knows when a process is a server silo is running as a Windows server container. And if it tries to escalate privilege or do other things, the kernel is able to check that and restrict it. But there's still some potential, from our conservative approach in saying there's still potential for interaction with the host kernel because the kernel is shared, just as a Linux container would be, a shared kernel. It's kind of the same principle. It's like when you're sharing the kernel with the host, there's some potential for communication with the host, and if there's things that we haven't discovered yet, then that's a potential attack vector. Hyper-V, it's the same level of isolation as a Hyper-V VM. So you're running on the hypervisor. It's literally running in a dedicated VM, and there's total separation from the host.
This is wonderful. Thank you. This clears so many confusion, for us, and we can better inform our customers on, the strategy. So thank you for that.
Yep, no problem. Feel free to reach out to me if you have more questions.
Absolutely.
And one other thing to note is that the host process containers really are not intended to be used for like as workloads. They're mainly intended to be used for doing cluster administration and node maintenance type things, patching your nodes, getting things bootstrapped so that you can join the node to the cluster, and have all of that maintained via containers and daemon sets rather than needing to log into the Windows nodes themselves. We really don't anticipate or don't recommend running workloads as the host process containers because they do bypass they do kind of don't really have a good isolation model by design, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's an operator in some sense, right? Like helps you patch, whatever.
Yeah, we do not want anyone running their workloads in, their regular production workloads in host process containers, because it's the same as running just directly on the host VM. The nice thing about them is that you can restrict your administrative workloads to a single, container instance, in a single pod, and then all of your regular Windows Server container workloads you can run, super restricted user accounts on your regular Windows Server containers, because you don't need any sort of privileged access or privileged, capability.
Okay.
We're coming up on time here.
One quick question, sorry. On the tech note you sent, Brandon, I don't see Windows Server 2022 on the list. Is that in the plan? Because 2022, I believe, is going out of support in May. So a lot of our customers are actually moving on to 2022. So I want to make sure that's in the plan as well.
Sorry, which tech note?
This CVE that you sent for the unit 42.
I think I pasted that, not Brandon.
Oh, yeah. No, the fix was released, for all Windows Server versions in February. That includes Windows Server 2022.
Okay.
So, and also, this may be a little bit of a distraction, but it might be good to highlight here, since it is security focused, that the way that the Windows servicing model usually works, and there's always going to be potential caveats, but in order for security fixes to be eligible to be backported into an older OS version like Windows Server 2019, that same fix must be present in all future code bases. So Windows Server 2022 would have any fixes that were detected in Windows Server 2019, kind of as a general rule.
I see. Okay, got it.
Yeah, the fix was released before Server 2022 was even released. So out of box, Server 2022 already has all the fixes in it. There's no need to install any KBs.
Cool. So we're 2 minutes past. We had two more items. The GMSA one, Jay, I followed up on the thread. I think it was just missing some DNS settings maybe, but I'm happy to follow up more on that thread there. And then the GMSA one, maybe we can talk a little bit more about it next week. Jamie, once you dig in, I'll bump it to next week. Claude would be able to help with the image promotion process, probably the best here. So if you have questions, you can reach out to him.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that. I've been working on promoting things and setting up registries. I can give you some pointers if you need.
Yeah,
I'll reach
if
out
you
to
can do
y'all.
that in the channel so I can follow along, I'd like to, I know a little bit about it, but would like to learn more. So.
Yeah,
Cool.
I mean, I'm happy to. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's cool. One other last thing is the reboot tests. I'd like to start running those downstream, and we had one last thing around them, which was the 5-minute sleep, which for us, we've just got, we run on sort of over provisioned hardware downstream, and so that's why we did a 5-minute sleep. And I'm wondering whether we could start with those, flag them as disruptive, and then do like a small iteration to make them smarter later, or is that like a big red flag? That we have some reboot tests, Muzz, I see you in Zoom, that reboot nodes and then check to see if the nodes are still, they reboot the host. Yeah.
I think they should be marked as disruptive by default because they are restarting the node itself.
Either way, they're disruptive, yeah.
Yeah, there's no other way around it.
But my other question is, can we, right now, the only issue we have is we never finished making a smarter way to detect whether the node was online or not. And we didn't really think of a really good way to do that.
I mean, kubelet should start becoming available again, right?
So just check the node readiness flag, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we do too. And we actually mark those tests as serial, like disruptive and serial.
Oh, disrupt. Yeah, that's a good idea. I think they're flagged as serial, but if that's the sort of final way to do it, I guess we could just put that in there. I'll update the comment on that.
Disruptive serial, and make sure that the node conditions, the node status conditions, they are ready. And like in some cases, we actually try to schedule a pod, like create a pod, make sure that it lands onto the newly rebooted node.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, that's a very good idea. Because it might happen to flake in some scenarios in which the node reboots so fast, it doesn't really miss any health or life checks.
Yeah, that was a concern we had, which is why we did a long sleep. Because that's kind
Before
of
rebooting, are you draining the node?
We're not actively draining it. We're just, that's kind of the point of it, is supposed to just be like a hard reboot.
I see. So what about the pod statuses? Like sometimes what we try to do is, before the reboot happens, get the list of pods on the node, save it somewhere, and then depending on how you have created those pods, they may come up or they may not come up on the same node.
Well, if it's serial, there shouldn't be any other pods on the node, right? Unless you spawn them in the test.
No, it's not about that. So there can be a higher level controller, which when sees that the node is not available anymore, it may evict those pods, and then those pods may come up on some other node.
So that's kind of the tricky thing that we ran into, which is why I kind of brought this up, is we weren't like it wasn't trivial to detect you can skip a beat if you're not polling fast enough, where like if the reboot happens really fast, you might not ever even know that your kubelet went down. And that was my original thing. It's like, well, maybe we should just do the dumb thing that we're doing right now. Just wait a ridiculous period of time and then and then check if the node's working, because that works, right? Like it's not going to take 11 minutes to reboot a node, but it might take 5 minutes, and that would allow us to have this test upstream, right? And then we could have like a separate thing about making the test smarter, but that's a tricky thing. Like it's not easy to guarantee that you detected a reboot.
Thought we were gonna use a plugin or something.
Oh,
I thought
plugin.
Winley said she was working on a plugin, and that's kind of what I was waiting for there.
Was she? I don't know. Let me see.
Sorry, what plugin is that?
Oh, she was gonna. We asked about this on the PR. Let me see if I can open it up.
Yeah, it's 104698.
Yeah. Yeah. The suggestion was you could extend the custom plugin monitor, and she said she was working on it.
Yeah,
But-
I think she kind of. I think she never got that working though.
Okay.
I can ask her again if we think that's important. From my perspective, though, this is a disruptive test, and it takes a while. And I'm like, well, unless people are worried about that 10-minute sleep for some other fundamental reason, I'm kind of like, what if we just merged it and did something fancy later?
If it is 10 minutes, we may see some backlash. But
Yeah. Well, we just empirically were like, well, we ran it a bunch of times and we're like, yeah, it definitely reboots within 10 minutes, even on horrible hardware. But the problem is sometimes it reboots like fast. Like if you're on a fast vSphere instance or a fast cloud instance, like we do this on, we run these tests on bare hardware and we also run them in this nested virtualization environment. We see both extremes. We see the reboot happening so fast that that you never actually detect a reboot happening. And then we also see the reboot happening so slow that it's like, you know, you could detect it.
yeah, get the
What
note.
if?
Sorry, go ahead, Robbie.
Go ahead, Ravi. Sorry.
Yeah, so we have been doing it in case of OpenShift, and what we try to do is when we try to bring down the node, we will have a workload, make sure that it gets drained, reboot, and then we will schedule a new workload onto the new node, wait for the workload to be available. That should give us an indication with the timeout.
Yeah, you could do like a daemon set. You could do like a Windows
Yeah.
daemon set, wait for it to not be available. And then, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
because that would take away the dependency on lower level constructs like node or other object. Rather, we will try to rely on the workload, which should give us a very good indication.
so even then though, you still have a race condition because if you're not pulling you may not actually see, you still might not see that pod go down. I mean, I've seen nodes go down and the pod status not get updated.
So what I heard was drain it, like restart it, and then apply another pod to that particular node. In that way, you would see it go off, and then you would see it come back on.
Yeah, the drain. Yeah, you're right. So the drain solves that because you guaranteed if you wait for the drain to happen, you're guaranteed. That's why, yeah.
I was also thinking about spawning a pod on the node you want to restart to do something like ping localhost or something infinitely, then restart the node and continuously try to get the pod logs. If you're no longer able to get the pod logs, it means the host must be down because kubelet has to respond with the pod logs. If it doesn't, it means it's down. I think.
Yeah.
Sometimes it may crash loop back off. We will get the logs momentarily.
Yeah. The drain would work. That's a lot of code to write a drain. We could do that, but I still have the other question of, is this useful? As opposed to just waiting 10 minutes. And if it's useful, if the consensus is it's useful, we can do the drain. But if nobody actually cares, my like dumb brain would just wait 10 minutes for the reboot to happen and then go, or iterate on this solution later.
You do not even have to.
No strong opinions here, though. I'm just wondering, do people really care about that sleep, or are we just suggesting better ideas that could be iterated on? That's the real question I have.
I mean, if you're gonna have to sleep for such a long time, you'll also have to add the slow tag. I think we mentioned that already. But if you actually manage to do it in a smarter way as you want, then the slow tag might not be necessary anymore. I think the threshold is that the test should be shorter than 5 minutes, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, that's a good reason to do it the right way. I just wanted a good reason to do it the right way. So we're suggesting we want to do it the right way to reduce the test time. That's fair.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm gonna relay that, and then I like Ravi's pod drain idea, because you're right. Even the crash loop back off, you still might be able to get the logs, but if you drain, then. And now my question is, I wonder if that would be useful for something else. Like, is there any other
You
situation?
don't even have to do a drain, Jay. Like, to be
Yeah.
clear, you can just evict the pod or delete the pod, and then create another pod on the same node. Like, say if you have a single pod running on that node, just delete it or evict it, and then start the reboot.
Delete it. Yeah.
My quick question here, though, is what's the purpose of this restart test? What are we testing for? Just that the node restarts, or that if a node crashes and there's pods running on the node, do those pods come back up and work properly? Because there's like, I've seen Windows nodes go offline, and when it starts back up, if the pod was still scheduled to that node, there's problems. So I'm wondering if we just delete the pod and then deploy it again, we're not actually catching the issue that we are.
So we actually have found that it's kind of embarrassing, but now that you ask, with Antria, we found that rebooting a node actually completely destroys the entire network stack because of the way it extends OVS. So for us, we just want the stupidest reboot possible. We don't care about any fancy stuff. But there's this whole other conversation this opens up about, well, there's a lot of other stuff you'd want to test, one of which is the thing you talked about, right? Like, do you have stale volumes? Do you have pods that are attached to storage that the storage can't reattach somewhere else? Do you have, like, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong once you reboot a node, right? So, yeah, like, my answer here, even though your question wasn't a yes or no question, my answer is yes. Like, we're thinking that same thing, right? Like,
yeah, I agree. I think we can test a lot of things to make sure that everything works properly. For example, should the pods still be alive or be restarted if the node restarts, and do they become alive? Or secondly, what we could check as well, if there are any leaked volumes, if there are any leaked CNI IPs, and so on and so forth, just to make sure we don't eventually crash because of stuff like this. Because I actually noticed one thing in Azure CNI. If you are restarting the node and you still have pods, those IPs that were already assigned, they are never cleaned up afterwards, apparently.
Yeah.
Which was interesting to see.
Yeah, it's like, so there's, So, I mean, that makes me more excited about doing the reboot thing in a structured way, because maybe we can build a whole library of other tests on top of this. And so now I can see why this might be useful to do it the right way.
I think it's a nice idea.
So let me update the pull request with the details from this conversation. So I'm going to update the pull request and talked with Ravi Santosh Goodly Mehta. Ravi, you have the longest nick of anybody in SIG Windows. James Sturvant and Claudio.
You always get my name wrong, by the way.
I got it right this time. Claudio. And we want to use a pod as a semaphore to indicate node being up. So, okay. Schedule pod direct to a Windows node. Reboot that node. Detect the pod being taken offline. You mentioned don't delete the pod, but I think you have to take the pod. I think you have to reboot. You have to not delete the pod, reboot the node, and then
You can do both, Jay. Like depending on what your use case is. Like we can have some stateful sets. We can have some stateless workloads running on the node. Like say if you have a stateful set, we should provision the disk, make sure that it is in sync on other node. Say if the workload gets scheduled onto another node. So depending on the use case, you can do both.
okay, you know what? I think the curl thing, you schedule a pod and curl from it, but don't curl the logs. Actually, curl an endpoint until it goes down. Until the endpoint goes, you just have to curl it really fast.
The pod will restart. Can we just like the pod has access to the API server and puts a label on the node, and when it restarts when it starts up again, it just labels the node. It puts a new like, hey, I started up at this time. It was after a given time, like and compare times. But
Schedule a pod that like labels the node.
yeah, it says, hey, I started at this time, and then issue a restart, and then the pod will have to restart. And at that point, it labels another issue. And if those times are in sequence, then we know that it restarted.
I'd like that solution if it didn't require API access. I'm just thinking running these in different environments, you know, like.
Yeah, you also need to have RBAC for the node.
Yeah.
within the
I
pod.
mean, usually you would have those service accounts, but I like that better. But I think the stupid thing of curling is you're not going to go wrong with that, right? Like, and it's super easy to read it in the code. You curl for curl until not working, right? Like, you don't have to compare. But I like the timestamp thing better, theoretically, though. Schedule a pod, right? But this will do it. Then you reboot. Then if you reboot that node. Yeah. Once down, reboot. Once down. Tests. Now a new family of tests can be written. But this issue is once node back up is done, and we can do those in follow on issues. Cool. Okay,
Cool.
I added a comment there, James, if you want to go on 104698. I think it's probably just summarizes mostly what we talked about here. Cool.
Cool. I think we should call this meeting quits and then maybe cut over to the programming.
Yeah, I also need to drop, but thank you.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Stop recording.
Okay,
now.
are folks sticking around for the pairing session, or see if people stick around?
To be fair, I thought this was the pairing pairing.
I feel like we
session
did
already.
pair. Like yeah.
Yeah.
I got plenty of other shit to do. So whatever you guys want to do, I don't know.
Well,
I wouldn't mind a walk through the GMSA stuff that you're looking at, Jamie.
I think Nikhil joined because he had some issues in SIG Windows and a meme had invited him. So
Cool.
Yeah, we can pair
Hello.
that.
Hi, Nikhil.